Shirley truly has lived the most incredible of lives, which we're going to be hearing about this evening. A life very full and very rich, not just of success and triumph, but also a certain amount of adversity, of tragedy, and some heartache along the way. So we're going to be talking about all of that this evening. She came here only at the age of 5 on the Kindertransport as a refugee from Vienna, and went on really to soar to the greatest of heights. She started up her own company, Freelance Programmers, in 1962, not only when a software company when software barely existed, but also a company with an all-female team, pioneering flexible working hours and really empowering a generation of women, particularly women in tech. And selling that company eventually, she made 70 people millionaires. That would be an extraordinary. We could embellish that here this evening. 70 people millionaires. She's now perhaps best known for being one of our country's greatest philanthropists, and her foundation has given away, and we are definitely allowed to say that, 68 million and counting. If I was to list all the accolades and lists of extraordinary women and most powerful women that she'd been on, I think we should be here all evening. But one particularly of note is that in 2017, she received the Companion of Honor, which makes her one of only 65 people in the world to have done that. So that is pretty extraordinary. I think Paul McCartney and J.K. Rowling were. Her Memoirs, Let It Go, is a beautiful book which charts her life with all its ups and downs, and it's no wonder that filmmakers are wanting to pounce on it. I think filming starts later this year, and I've heard rumours that Kate Winslet and perhaps Emily Blunt, are in the running for the lead role. So you'll obviously agree we are extraordinarily lucky to have her here with us this evening. And I'm just going to hand over now to you for the next 15 minutes to tell your story. Thank you very much indeed, Dame Giuseppe Shirley.
My memoir, Let It Go, really confused the publishers. Was it about my being a refugee? Or as a woman who set up a high-tech software house in the days that software was given away free with the hardware? As an organization that eventually employed 8,500 people? Or as mother of an autistic child? Or is it about a philanthropist who's given away serious money? It turns out I'm all of these, so let me tell you my story. But beware, the older I get, the better I used to be. When Mozart was my age, he'd already been dead for 50 years. All that I am stems from when, in 1939, I was put on a train in Vienna, part of the Kindertransport, which saved nearly 10,000, mainly Jewish children, from Nazi Europe. 5 years old, clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister, I had very little idea as to what really was going on. What is England, and why am I going there? I'm only alive because so long ago I was saved by generous strangers. I was lucky, and doubly lucky to be later reunited with my birth parents, though, sadly, I never bonded with them again. But I've done so much in the 8 decades since that heartbreaking day when my mother put me on the train that really I would have ever believed possible. I love England, my adopted country, with a passion perhaps that only someone who has lost their human rights can feel. I decided to make my life a life that was worth saving. And then I just got on with it. At 18, I had a junior position in public service, and I was horrified to find that there were 2 pay scales, one for men and another pay scale lower for the women. And to get past the gender issues of the time, I'm talking about the late 50s and the 1960s, I set up my own high-tech software company it was one of the first UK such startups. But the important thing was that it was a company of women, a company for women, an early social business. And people laughed at the very idea. You can't sell software. As you've heard, it was given away free at that time. They laughed even louder at my crusade for women, because although women were coming out of the universities with decent degrees, there really was a concrete ceiling almost to our progress. And I'd hit that ceiling too often. I wanted opportunities for women. So I recruited professionally qualified women who'd left the computer industry on marriage or when their first child was expected, and structured them into a home working organization. And we pioneered the concept of women going back into the workforce after a career break, as a euphemism for having children, of course. We pioneered a whole lot of new work methods, all kinds of flexible working, job shares, then profit shares, and later co-ownership when I got a quarter of the shares into the hands of the staff at no cost to anyone but me. So I was doing lots of new things. And for years I was the first woman this, the only woman that. In those days, women couldn't work on the stock exchange or drive a bus or fly an aeroplane. I even had to get my husband's signature to open the company's bank account. My generation of women basically fought the battles for the right to work and for equal pay. When, in my first job, when handsome young men used to offer to carry my equipment for me, I used to say somewhat aggressively, I believe in equal pay, so we'll carry my own things. Nowadays, of course, I say, oh, how kind. No one expected much from women at work or in society, because all the expectations really were about home and family responsibilities. And I just couldn't accept that. And I started to challenge the conventions of the time, even to the extent of changing my name from Stephanie to Steve in my business development letters, so as to get through the door and be shaking hands before anyone realized that he was a she. My company, called Freelance Programmers, as Hannah told you, which was exactly what it was, Freelance Programmers, couldn't have started smaller. On my dining room table, with what would now be £100, and so financed by my own labour and by taking a second mortgage on our little home. My interests were scientific. The market was commercial. So I hit a compromise with operational research work, which was intellectually challenging, so I found it interesting, but also commercially valued. And so it was things like scheduling freight trains for British Rail, timetabling buses. Scientific stock control was just coming in, so there was lots of stock control. Everything from enormous cables and to tiny little tubs of ice cream, which of course also melt. But gradually the work came in. And we disguised the domestic and part-time nature of the workforce by offering fixed prices, one of the first to do so for software. Who would have guessed that the programming of the black box flight recorder for supersonic Concorde was done by a bunch of women working in their own homes. All we used was a trust the staff approach and the simple telephone. We even used to ask applicants, not do you have a telephone, but do you have access to a telephone? It was a very different world. And an early project, we were lucky to get a project that paid us to develop software standards, sort of management control protocols. Software was and is maddeningly hard to pin down activity. So that was enormously valuable. We were even paid to update the standards over the years, and they gave us a reputation for control of this buzzy sort of discipline, and some variant of those standards is still in use today by NATO. Our programmers, remember, only women, including gay and transgender, worked with pencil and paper, writing flowcharts, defining the task to be done. They then wrote code, usually machine code, but sometimes in binary, which was sent by snail mail to a data center to be punched onto cards or paper tape, and then repunched in order to verify all that prior to submission to the mainframe computer. And that was programming, coding, in 1962. And our schedules were based on 2 such accesses to the computer a week. In 1975, 13 years after the company started, equal opportunities legislation came in Britain, and that made our pro-female policies illegal. So as an example of unintended consequences, my woman's company had to let the men in, if they were good enough. When I started my company of women, some people said, yes, very interesting, but of course it only works because it's small. And later on, as the company grew, the same people said, well, yes, it's sizable now, but of no strategic interest. Later still, when the company was valued at nearly $3 billion, and I'd made 70 of the staff into millionaires, they had the nerve to comment, well done, Steve. But of course, it's nothing new. What an attitude to change. You could always tell ambitious women by the shape of our heads. They're flat on top from being patted patronizingly. Women, we still have a long way to go. Let me share with you 2 secrets of commercial success. Always surround yourself with first-class people and people that you like, and I don't mean people like you. And choose your partner very carefully. And the other day when I said, my husband's an angel, a woman complained. You're lucky, she said. Mine's still alive. It's one thing to have an idea for an enterprise, but as most people here might know, to then make it happen demands extraordinary energy, self-belief, and commitment. The courage to risk family and home, and a 24/7 commitment that really borders on the obsessive. So it's just as well that I believe in the beauty of work when we do it properly and in humility. And work is not just something that I do when I'd rather be doing something else. If success were easy, we'd all be millionaires. But in my case, it came in the midst of family pressures and indeed crisis. Our late son, Giles, was a beautiful, contented baby. And then at 2.5, like a changeling in a fairy story, he lost the little speech that he had and turned into a wild, unmanageable toddler. Not the terrible twos. He was severely autistic, and he never spoke again. Giles was the first resident in the first home of the first charity that I set up to pioneer services for autism. And then there was the groundbreaking Prowse Court School for pupils with autism, and then an autism research charity. And these three charities together now employ 1,000 people. Whenever I see a gap in services, I try to help. I like doing new things. I like making new things happen, though first mover advantages are usually grossly over-exaggerated. And first does not have to mean only. And so that some of my wealth goes back to the computer industry from which it stems. I've also funded a number of IT ventures and co-founded the Oxford Internet Institute, which focuses not on the technology, but on the social, economic, legal, and ethical issues of this network of networks. Giles died unexpectedly nearly 20 years ago now, but I have learnt to live without him, and I have learnt to live without his need of me. Philanthropy is all that I do now. Nothing to do with stamps. But I need never worry about getting lost, because several charities would quickly come and find me. And philanthropy does not necessarily come wrapped in cash, but the more money I give away, I assure you, the richer my life seems to become. I came close to annihilation at the onset of my life, and deep down, I remain a refugee. We never know what life holds for us. We waste too much time being afraid, when what we should really fear is wasting time. Thank you very much.
There's quite an extraordinary amount to cover. We will do what we can, and you will, of course, have some time to answer questions in not too long, so make sure you store them up and don't go away wishing you'd missed such a unique opportunity to do so. But it's my turn first. You said that all that you are stems from when you got on that train in Vienna. What do you mean? How far has that shaped your life? But also, what do you remember specifically from that time?
Well, let's take the bit that I remember first. I remember the things of a child. I remember the lost doll. I remember the little boy who kept being sick. I remember the rather frightening entry of uniformed guards at one stage. But I don't remember any of the politics or what was going on. I know now that we went from Vienna to the Hoek van Holland, then over to Harwich, and finished up at Liverpool Street Station. And that 2.5-day journey has made an enormous difference to my life. Partly because I had to deal with so much trauma and change new family, new language, new food, new everything, that I became able to deal with change and eventually learned to like change. I enjoy it, and that's useful in my high-tech career. But I also learned that when I got here, a lot of people were sort of saying to me, aren't you lucky to be saved? Now, you don't really say that to a 6-year-old, you know, but I got a lot of this, aren't you lucky to be saved? And I realized I was very lucky, and at that stage started to feel that I really have to justify my existence and make sure that the life that was saved was worth saving. And finally, as I mentioned, I am a patriot. I'm not political in any way, but I do love this country, perhaps in a way that only a refugee can.
And did you immediately have a close bond with your foster parents? Or was that a difficult relationship to establish at the start?
It wasn't difficult, but it was slow. Let me give their name, Guy and Ruby Smith. A middle-aged couple without children in the Midlands of England who had seen a little notice in the local paper with photographs of my sister and I saying two sisters from a good home seeking help. They took us in and they brought us up really as they would their own children. So I am certainly their child in all but birth. They were lovely people. I honour their memories, as indeed I honour all the aunties and uncles who saw us children through those terrible times. But I try really to, by doing what giving people do, I try to pass that on to others. Yes, of course, I looked after them in their old age. It was a good relationship. Not all foster parents were so successful, but I was lucky and I'm very aware of it.
And you write in Let It Go a bit about your relationship with your own parents and a certain feeling of rejection that kind of spanned through your life. Do you think that what you were driven to go on to do was a way of almost compensating for that?
No, I think it was very much more this justifying my existence. We can't just go on taking from the world. We have to give, and give more than we get, because there's so many poor people.
Do you feel then that generally your life shows that great success often comes from adversity?
I think the adversity toughens you up, and that's important certainly for commercial success. People remember entrepreneurs for our successes, but in fact we've had lots of failures, but we've been resilient enough to pick ourselves up and brush ourselves down and move on. And so after a bit, you don't even know about some of my failures. I failed in America, I failed in Scandinavia, I failed in Benelux, but I succeeded in India. So, you know, all people remember is that half our staff finished up in India. Interesting.
And I want to come back, hopefully if I have time, a little bit to the refugee thing and bring it perhaps a little bit, make it more relevant to today. But let's move on to freelance programmers. I mean, you write in the book, I don't think that it had been consciously feminist when you founded it. You have not heard of feminism in 1962. How much do you think it was about empowering women when you first started it?
Oh, it was very much about empowering women. We did not, I was inspired really by the Black Power in America, but I hadn't really read very much about feminism. But what I did know was that there were lots of women like me who didn't feel we were getting a fair deal, and so I thought, well, I will set up a company that's the sort of company I would want to work for, that was, you know, family-friendly and flexible to the extreme. And that single-minded focus really held us together through good times and bad.
You said that your head was flat, or that ambitious women's heads were flat because they had been patted so frequently and patronizingly. But how bad was sexism in that day that you encountered?
Well, I mentioned the different pay scales for men and women. I mean, today we have a gender pay gap, but for the same work, men and women are paid equally in nearly all situations that you look at. I needed to go on, from the work point of view, I needed to go on a ship. Women are not allowed on ships. From the work point of view, people were sort of saying, I would never appoint a woman to this position, never. These are graduate positions. The down-to-earth sexism, I mean, you know, you'd have a junior minister trying to pinch my bottom because I was, you know, selling some software to him. I mean, these were ways in which women were so denigrated that it was quite hard to remain professional, to remain confident in the things that our gender are particularly good at, and make sure that we don't let ourselves be patronized too much. But you have to sort of fit in to a certain extent. We, for example, in the early days of freelance programs, we would never wear trousers because we thought it was challenging the men on their masculinity. Now I live in trousers all the time, they're so comfortable.
Me too. Well, talking about now then, you can wear trousers, but do you look around today and think, great, we've come a long way, or do you think we have a long way to go? We
have come a long way, we really have. Women, the law is not holding us back. What today's young women are facing are cultural issues, and to an extent they are more difficult to challenge. You know, I did manage to get certain legislative changes, but to change a culture, very, very hard, and much easier to do it, as I did, in a greenfield situation, where I start a new organisation, which has this new culture that's led really to the gig economy, very, very flexible.
And that, let's talk a little bit about that, because obviously the flexible working hours or freelancing, which now is much more ubiquitous, many more of us are doing it, but you are a great believer in that. And what do you think are the great advantages of being able to have flexible working hours?
Well, it attracts a broader workforce. We had people who wanted to work certain months in the year flexibly because they actually sang in an opera chorus or something, so when they occasionally got some work, they wanted to work in the Covent Garden. The rest of the time they worked with us. So there's that sort of flexibility. Many, many women who with domestic responsibilities, and I discovered that many women are also looking after disabled partners or elderly parents. So it really broadens the pool from which one is looking for talent. The demand for talent is so strong that we actually have to exploit what talent there is and know that a diverse workforce with all sorts of people, young, old, black, white, is more likely to be innovative and come out with those ideas that really make a difference in the world.
Actually, today it's an argument against sort of quotas, isn't it? Yeah.
I've always been against quotas. The one that's always quoted, no pun intended, is Norway, where they did have quotas for women on boards, and it did make a difference. There are far more women on boards in Norway than anywhere else. But it didn't bring women up generally, and it didn't actually engender that empowerment of women throughout the organisation. So what really brings us in is that flexibility, the access to skills, the dedication, and the skills that each of us has that needs to work with other people to make it tangible.
You write a lot, or you mentioned before the fact that actually having fun and getting along with your colleagues is an extraordinarily important thing, and you emphasize that a lot. I think one time when you come together for a party and you say that the thing you really notice is that you all largely got on very well and how important that is.
Yes, it was slightly worrying because it was a bit sort of homogeneous, it was a bit middle class. We only had a few black faces, we had quite a few Asian faces. And that was difficult to change because that was the times, really. We did enjoy each other's company. Some of the groups, I'm retired 25 years, some of the groups still meet. We had a reunion for 150 people last year. We like each other. We have a lot of fun. When I walk down a corridor, I like to hear gales of laughter. I don't want a stolid silence. So that's my personality. And of course, an entrepreneur, we impose our personality on the whole organization.
Let's talk a little bit about another thing that's obviously a great passion of yours, or something that you think is, again, a good idea in terms of, as well as freelancing, but shared ownership. And that's a pattern that seems to come through your life and the importance of that.
I wonder if anyone here has got experience of shared ownership. I was inspired by the John Lewis Partnership, and later on I became a director of John Lewis. But what it means is that you share the risks. Freelancers, maybe there won't be any work next month. That is real risk for many people. But you should also, I believe, you should also share the rewards. And although it was a long time before we became financially successful, as I say, a lot of the staff really made serious money. And I'm very, very proud of having shared the company with the staff to that extent.
And you talk about, you still feel that gratitude today. The staff have come back today. You still hear from them the difference and the impact you made on their lives.
Yes. I always look forward to Christmas, not because I'm a Christian, sorry, in a church here, but I get such lovely Christmas cards and little Christmas messages from these many, many people who bring me up to date with how they're doing and how their children are doing. And one has just become president of the Australian Computer Society and this sort of thing. And you really get a sort of warm feeling that you have actually a virtual family of colleagues. Women feel like that, actually.
Another thing that we were speaking about it earlier, and you're obviously a very hard worker, and you said it's a derogatory term, but I think you call yourself a workaholic. You write that if you had to offer a simple explanation for your company's survival and ultimate success, it would be just this: my hard work. Can you relax from that? Can you let go in that sense?
I'm defined by my work. That is what I am, that is who I am. I don't often switch off. The only time I really forgot work was when I was with my son. And the only time I forgot him was when I was working, so there was a sort of balance of things there. Nowadays, I swim 2 or 3 times a week, and that's half an hour where I really switch off, and you get a lot of ideas at that time as well. So I'm not very good at not working.
You, at one stage in your life, as you say, a good old-fashioned nervous breakdown. Do you think that was about working so hard, or was that related to Giles?
I think it was related to Giles. I mean, the pressure on a family with an autistic member is enormously stressful. Financially, it's debilitating, but the whole family becomes autistic, and I'm pretty sure that was Giles.
Because you've said that actually the only time that you could not think about Giles was when you're working and vice versa. Do you think that there's a sense in which work provided an escape from the hardships?
I always felt that with work, in the computer work, it's very sort of binary, it's either right or it's wrong, it's a scientific discipline. But with that, I could get it right, I could make it better, I could do it better than I did last week. Whereas with an autistic child, I didn't get that feeling that I was really progressing. And the more vulnerable a child, I think, the more love you give and the more they need, certainly. But in no way is it an easy life.
In order to sort of to change that, you've obviously devoted a great deal of your life since to giving your money away to autism charities. And how far do you think we've come in that sense? Do you feel positive and optimistic about the future in terms of dealing with autism as a problem?
Well, I'm a glass half full sort of person. Autism used to be considered to be a psychological problem caused by poor parenting. So that's not very nice for the parents. We now know that it is a brain disorder. We clearly know one or two of the causes. We know that 80% of it is genetic. The other 20% is totally unknown. So yes, I think things have moved on enormously. There's still a lot to do, but yes, it is much, much better for the number of people with autism in hospitals, institutionalized. We're now living in the community, really dignified lives in the main. Not easy, but we do it.
The book's obviously called Letting Go. I know that the meaning of that stretches in a number of different directions. So why did you call it Letting Go?
I think it started with the idea of letting go of the rancor of having been a refugee. I mean, it is not a good start in life. There are even things today that I think, anyway. And then I learned that as a management style, I was better withdrawing the skills out of the staff when I did not tell them what to do, but I listened, I let go of the panoply of management and let people develop in their own way. And then, of course, with the money, I realized money is not going to make my son healthy. So I have to let it go. And I've said before that the more money I give away, the happier I am, and the richer my life seems to be.
I'd want to come to that, to the giving away of the money shortly, but just to pick up on what you said about being able to trust others, that seems to be a hugely important theme, which is difficult for you, I think it feels, in many ways. Sometimes it's very hard. I think you say at one point you felt like you were being airbrushed out of history when you had to hand over the reins to other people. It's a hard thing to do when you've worked so hard to build up a company.
Yes, I think we all have instances where somebody stabs you in the back, or things go wrong, or people are not honest in their relationship. But that doesn't happen all the time, and because it's happened once, one needs to know that one doesn't assume that it's going to happen the next time. So that trust in other people is generally well-founded, and I find that commonality of spirit with other people is important to me. I feel close to the parents of autistic children that I meet. I've been through their version of hell. I know that it's probably the most loving thing that they can do is to let their children go to professionals. And that, I think, is a parallel with how my mother let me go and sent me to total strangers, thinking never to see me again. So that give and take of life is pretty important to me.
You did see your mother again, but you said in the open talk you never quite had the same relationship. Why do you think that was? Was that a difficult thing?
Well, apparently it's quite common that children whose family is scattered for years when they are young do not really get together again properly. So, I mean, I was with my parents, I honored them, I looked after my mother when she was old and so on, but I was a dutiful daughter rather than a loving daughter. And that's a very sad thing, sad for me and sad for her. But that's how it was. We were very damaged by what happened to the family. We all survived physically, but mentally it really had problems, and it showed itself in those family relationships.
Coming back to the letting go of your cash, as you said, or as the philanthropy side of things. You said that when you suddenly, making money wasn't what incentivized you, but when you did suddenly come into money, you felt a sort of certain unease.
Well, I've been really poor, and it seems almost obscene to be so wealthy. You have to come to terms with wealth and with success, whatever that means to you. Quite how different people make that transition, I don't know. I find I'm much more comfortable. I'm still very wealthy, but I have given the bulk of the stuff away, and I'm very happy with that. When we share whatever gifts we have in life, they grow, they improve, they engender more. And I know that when I talk about the pleasure that I get from giving, I encourage other people to give. Some people think that giving money is all that matters, but in fact, everybody can be a philanthropist because we can give time or skills or introductions or ideas. That's what makes charities operate.
But you think that British people aren't such good philanthropists because we're all too worried about talking about money, which is why it's important to try and change that, and which is why you're open with how much you've given and things like that, to encourage other people to be so open. Unlike Americans, I think, you feel.
Well, the Americans really boast about how much they've given, and I've given more, and this I've given to this one, and have you given that? And it's really a different culture. It's their way of showing that they have arrived. Here we still have the remnants of a class system, and we don't talk about money and what we do with it.
How can we change that?
Well, I did a year, 2009-10, as the National Ambassador for Philanthropy, and I really tried to tackle that, partly by changing some of the tax situations on giving, but also by talking very openly about giving, about the difference between charity and philanthropy. I mean, if you could put 50p into a street person's cap, that's a generous act of charity. But once you start thinking about that person, why is he on the streets? Why is she not in work? Why is he not in a hostel? Then you start to think like a philanthropist. And I describe myself as a venture philanthropist. I don't give, in general, to other charities. I set up projects, things that need doing, and I set up projects, staff them, finance them, manage them, and eventually get them what I call sustainable, by which I mean managerially and financially independent of me. That's, to me, a success.
I know that recently you gave your compensation for being a refugee back to safe passage. You talk a lot about being a refugee. Do you look around today and see a certain intolerance as something that saddens you?
I weep really for that this country that I love so much is now so against refugees. The German government has recently given restitution 80 years later to Kindertransport, people like me, and I'm giving mine little windfall to Safe Passage charity, which looks after today's child refugees. And Wednesday of this week, I've sort of had a project working together of how can we actually persuade the other 500 people estimated in this country who are Kindertransport to all give their money to today's thing. We had it so good. We were made so welcome. Schools took us in. Families took us in. People taught us the language. I mean, really, they made us welcome, and I hope we have repaid the country well.
I could go on talking about that, I think, for a great deal longer, but I'm just fascinated to find out what you think about the progress of technology. Obviously, it has, where perhaps the women issue has some time to go and has been a slow thing, progress of technology has been a rapid thing. Do you embrace it, or are you fearful for that in some ways?
Oh, I embrace it. It is so exciting. It really is. This rate of change has never been so fast. It'll never be as slow again. It really is. People at the moment are talking a lot about artificial intelligence, and that is it's starting already to make a real difference. Now, of course, there are dangers, of course, there are worries, of course, there are many people whose work will be displaced, but it will also create a lot of wealth and a lot of long-term employment. So I'm an enthusiast. I mean, I was described as a late pioneer of the industry. Now I'm just an early adopter. I use robots to teach autistic children. I did some virtual reality work, and things are not, they've been around longer. That was in 1999, so that's 20 years ago. So, yes, I love using the technology, and it has so much to give for all of us.
Do you have any worries for the fact, the amount of time, for example, that children and young people spend on it, or the sort of slightly darker side of it?
I read only. I don't have young children. That it is dangerous. I observe families who sit together at a meal and the children are, and I find that very strange. The world is changing. The way in which families operate is different. The way in which we eat and use our living space is different. So I observe and try to make sure that the technology is as benign as we can make it.
Can I ask, when you're looking back over all of the things that you've done, whether you can think there's one thing you feel the most proud of?
I think definitely it's opening doors for women. I'm very, very conscious of having pushed those doors open, and lovely to see the women thriving through and going ahead.
And what do you think is your general sort of, you have so much advice, you've learnt so much, but your most important sort of lessons that you've learned from the life you've lived that you would pass on to people?
Well, I have to take the let it go, isn't it? To let the rancor go, to move on, to not have the baggage of the past, to make sure that tomorrow is starting fresh, that we don't go to bed in dispute with the people that we love. And that's taken me through an interesting marriage. We have our diamond wedding this year, and I'm pretty proud of that. 60 years. I mean, he puts up with the way I work. He puts up with my cooking. But I do have a wonderful recipe for shepherd's pie. All I have to do is mention it, and he insists we eat out.
Thank you all very, very much. And Steve, Shirley, thank you so very much for coming in this evening.